What if you could recognize the signs of drifting from God? Would that help you in your faith walk? Hi, friends. I'm Betsy, and I want to welcome you to Moments to Ponder. If you're interested in learning more from the Bible, but sometimes struggle to know how it connects to your everyday life, then you're in the right place. This podcast is designed to help you get into God's Word and discover how to apply it to your real life. In this episode, we're closing out the book of Nehemiah by looking at a powerful warning. Spiritual drift rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly through compromise, neglect, cultural influence, and misalignment. Today, we'll unpack how God's people, despite sincere commitment, gradually drifted from their faith. Through Nehemiah's final reforms, we'll see how integrity, accountability, godly priorities, and spiritual discipline can help guard our hearts from this kind of drift. And we'll see why external behavior change alone is never enough without the true heart transformation Jesus gives. Welcome. This is episode 177. It happens to all of us. We drift. We see it in New Year's resolutions, new goals of eating healthier, or I'm going to read 15 minutes a day, even Bible reading plans. Before we know it, we haven't opened a book, we're picking up pizza again, and we haven't looked at the Bible plan in weeks. We always start with great intentions, don't we? I know I've downloaded so many apps, even paid for apps, only to fizzle out on them within a few weeks. Our commitment starts so sincere, but when passion becomes passive, drift begins. Whether a diet and exercise plan or a relationship, when we get inactive or passive about it, it fizzles. And it's the same with our spiritual walk. Spiritual drift doesn't usually happen all at once. It happens slowly through compromise, neglect, influence, or misalignment. And as we come to the end of the book of Nehemiah, the days of confession, wall building, and wall dedication, they're all in the past. They signed a covenant with God with every intention of keeping their promises. Yet, as we'll see, the people have drifted spiritually in ways that, honestly, continue to plague us today. And instead of a happy ending for this story, Nehemiah ends with a warning for his people, and in turn, for us. Even sincere commitment fizzles when spiritual focus fades. Let's dive in at verse 4 of chapter 13 in the book of Nehemiah. Before this happened, Eliashib, the priest, who had been appointed as supervisor of the storerooms of the temple of our God, and who was also a relative of Tobiah, had converted a large storeroom and placed it at Tobiah's disposal. The room had previously been used for storing the grain offerings, the frankincense, various articles for the temple, and the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil, which were prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, as well as the offerings for the priests. I, meaning Nehemiah, I was not in Jerusalem at that time, for I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign, though I later asked his permission to return. After serving 10 to 12-ish years in Jerusalem, Nehemiah had gone back to King Artaxerxes because he had promised to. That was his commitment. And then it seems a few years later, he is able to return to Jerusalem. And when he does, he discovers that a lot has happened, or actually not happened, while he's been away. I don't know if you noticed it, but verse 4 began by saying, before this had happened. So Nehemiah is letting us know that these few verses that I just read were backstory of what had happened before he had gotten back to Jerusalem. Verse 7. When I arrived back in Jerusalem, I learned about Eliashib's evil deed in providing Tobiah with a room in the courtyards of the temple of God. I became very upset and threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. Then I demanded that the rooms be purified, and I brought back the articles for God's temple, the grain offerings, and the frankincense. Eliashib was a priest, the supervisor of the storerooms in the temple, and he allowed an Ammonite to use the large storeroom in the temple. And it's not just any Ammonite, it's Tobiah, who was one of the men that had come against Nehemiah and tried to take him out. And remember, the temple rooms were only to be used by Levites and priests. Even Nehemiah refused to enter these rooms. Yet Eliashib, he allowed a pagan man to occupy a space in a holy building that had been set aside, that room, for holy offerings. He desecrated the temple. Now here we see the first drift warning: compromise. I'm pretty sure that this started small. Most compromise does. Tobiah asks for a little space in the courtyard to conduct his business. Then he asks for a place to store some of his products. And then, hey, that room is really large. Can I use it? After all the work on the wall, the festivals, and the Day of the Covenant, we see Eliashib, a high priest, drift. He shows us that he has a blind spot for his pagan relative as he compromises God's house. Without Nehemiah there, his faithfulness fell apart. I'm sure he didn't start out thinking he'd completely lose his job and reputation, but one compromise led to another, which led to another. And over time, he does something that he probably thought he'd never do. He compromised the purity of the temple. Eliashib shows us that small compromises create space for spiritual downfall. And it never happens big for us either, right? It starts small, seemingly innocent as we make choices that create room for unhealthy habits. It's only one bag of chips. I'm just gonna swipe right and see what happens. I'm just gonna check out this book. It's on the bestseller list, even though, And eventually we find ourselves justifying what once would have shocked us. What used to shock you that doesn't anymore? And why is that? Eliashib permitted Tobiah to move into the temple. Friends, what we permit eventually takes up residence. It becomes our new normal. So we need to ask ourselves, what have we allowed to move into our lives to become normal to us that if we took a step back, we can see should not be there? Nehemiah shows us the cure for compromise is integrity. It's about character. Without Nehemiah there, Eliashib falters. Integrity is holding to your standards of what you know to be right and true, even when no one is looking. And we get the impression that with Nehemiah not there to hold him to his integrity, Eliashib compromises. And because of the priest's lack of integrity, Nehemiah had to cleanse the temple. He doesn't confuse his love of his people with just being nice. He took bold action, which reminds me of Jesus when he cleansed the temple. Jesus loved his people enough to call them out on their compromise. Nehemiah is doing the same. Now, compromise opened the door, but sadly, that's not all Nehemiah discovered. We continue in verse 10. I also discovered that the Levites had not been given their prescribed portions of food, so they and the singers who were to conduct the worship services had all returned to work in their fields. I immediately confronted the leaders and demanded, why has the temple of God been neglected? Then I called all the Levites back again and restored them to their proper duties. And once more, all the people of Judah began bringing their tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the temple storerooms. I assigned supervisors for the storerooms, Shelmiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah one of the Levites. And I appointed Hanan son of Zakur and grandson of Mattaniah as their assistant. These men had an excellent reputation, and it was their job to make honest distribution to their fellow Levites. Remember this good deed, O my God, and do not forget all that I have faithfully done for the temple of my God and its services. Again, this probably happened slowly, the not giving to the temple part. I mean, we walk through this too, right? Like, oh, I want to give, but times are tight. So what if we just give half this time and then we can make ends meet? Oh, what if we just kept it all this time? We'd actually be able to get ahead. Did we give to the temple yet? Yeah, we don't give to the temple anymore. Over time, the people stopped supporting the work of the temple, meaning they stopped giving the offerings that supported the work of the Levites. And this caused the Levites to go find work somewhere else. And since the Levites weren't there, did the people stop attending temple too? We get the impression that they'd become okay with this, leaving their temple neglected. And by doing this, it opened spaces for even a high priest to compromise. Maybe without the giving, Eliashib needed income, so he charged to buy a rent for that storeroom. We don't know. But what we do know is that over time, the temple that was so highly valued lost its value. And this shows us the second warning sign of spiritual drift: neglect or indifference. None of the people would have said it straight out. But we neglect things that we don't value. If you don't value integrity, you compromise the temple. If you don't value those who serve at the temple, they leave. If you don't value a friendship, it falls apart. The truth is, spiritual drift often looks less like rebellion and more like slow indifference. Think about this for you. Where have you gotten indifferent or neglectful? Eating habits? A friendship? Your marriage? And in our spiritual lives, it can look like, well, I'm so busy. I'll pray later. And our Bible study becomes sporadic as we fill our time with, well, in our opinion, more urgent things. And we once attended church regularly, but then we started to watch it a little online, and then we switched to podcasts during the week, and worship became optional, and our community dissipated. We wouldn't say that we turned out our back on God, but in our neglect of our spiritual lives, we are devaluing Him as we allow our lives to drift. Nehemiah shows us that the cure for this is accountability. He confronted the leaders by calling them out. And we read that he found men of excellent reputation, great character and honesty. And they would keep the people accountable to their giving and continue the support of the temple work. We all stay on track better when there's accountability. That's why we have teachers and coaches and deadlines. We need these in our lives to remind us of what's important, to help us stay on track in areas that we know we want to value, but can often, get bored with them or lose track of them. Anything hard, especially if it requires a change in a habit or a change in thinking, actually needs an accountability factor. Neglect allowed what mattered to deteriorate, and this led to another drift issue, which we see when we begin in verse 15. In those days, I saw men of Judah treading out their wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys, and bringing their wine, grapes, and figs and all sorts of produce to Jerusalem to sell on the Sabbath. So I rebuked them for selling their produce on that day. Some men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise. They were selling it on the Sabbath to the people of Judah and in Jerusalem at that. So I confronted the nobles of Judah. Why are you profaning the Sabbath in this evil way? I asked. Wasn't it just this sort of thing that your ancestors did that caused our God to bring all this trouble upon us in our city? Now you're bringing even more wrath upon Israel by permitting the Sabbath to be desecrated in this way. I then commanded that the gates of Jerusalem should be shut as darkness fell every Friday evening, not to be opened until the Sabbath ended. I sent some of my own servants to guard the gates so that no merchandise could be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and tradesmen with a variety of wares camped outside Jerusalem once or twice, but I spoke sharply to them and said, "What are you doing out here, camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. I then commanded the Levites to purify themselves and to guard the gates in order to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath. Remember this good deed also, O my God. Have compassion on me according to your great and unfailing love. The Sabbath. This was a unique trait of the Jews, a day set apart. When the Israelites left Egypt, God gave them this gift of Sabbath, a day without work. It was a way to acknowledge that they were no longer slaves, but free people. Free people take days off. Slaves do not. When Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, the people were treating their Sabbath like any other workday. With these non-Jewish people living among them that didn't observe a Sabbath, the Jews see them with their shops open, doing business, and this influences them. And over time, the Jews made changes in how they observed the day of the Lord, if they even observed it at all. Their priorities changed. Another warning sign for spiritual drift is cultural influence. We have so many influences around us due to living in a world that doesn't follow Jesus. From music choices and clothing to language and content intake, we are influenced to wear, eat, listen, watch, and believe all kinds of things. Nehemiah saw the cultural slide through the observance of Sabbath. So let's just look at Sabbath more closely. According to Peter, it's not about a specific day. It's about prioritizing and living into the freedom that God gives rather than the slavery of our culture by setting aside one day a week to not work, which is actually what Sabbath means. A day to take delight in God and the life that He has given you, a day to focus on Him. I struggled with taking a Sabbath for years. And interestingly, they were the years that I worked in the church. See, when you work for the church, Sunday is a work day. And then throughout the week, there's so much to do that if I didn't keep at it, then who would? I mean, yes, I had a day off, and that was to do chores around the house and go to the kids' sports stuff and quick run to the grocery store. But a day without work of any kind, well, I didn't do that. I didn't take a Sabbath. And this led to exhaustion and burnout, which I've spoken of in past episodes. This led to a big question. Didn't I trust God enough to rest in Him for just one day a week? I wanted to say, of course, I trust God, but my work life would have told you differently. Control and achievement are big priorities in our world, and I had fallen for them. Sabbath taking is a trust and priority issue that affects our spiritual life. The priorities in our culture circle around achievement and productivity. Busyness and hustle are like gold medals today, even for our kids. COVID showed us this. When hustle and busyness stopped, many people didn't know who they were anymore. Our identity gets all wrapped up in what we do. And we pass this down to our kids who are struggling more than ever with identity today. When we let culture set our priorities, we begin to devote ourselves to the wrong things. What we prioritize, we don't neglect. And that's important. To cure the cultural influences fight and the drift that it causes in our lives, we need godly priorities and we need to remove the temptations. Nehemiah set up protection for the Israelites so they wouldn't be tempted by outside influences. And he did this by kicking out the temptation, those who came to sell. And then he resets the priority of Sabbath for the people. Sometimes we need to do the same. We need to kick out the temptation and reset priority. It is so easy to look around and allow our world to shape us. It brings an indifference to what may have bothered us even a year ago, and we begin to compromise rather than stand on what God has showed us to be true. Cultural influence reshaped the priorities of the Israelites, and this brings us to the fourth warning sign of drift. We continue in verse 23. About the same time, I realized that some of the men of Judah had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Furthermore, half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or of some other people and could not speak the language of Judah at all. So I confronted them and called down curses on them. I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. I made them swear in the name of God that they would not let their children intermarry with the pagan people of the land. Wasn't this exactly what led King Solomon of Israel into sin? I demanded. There was no king from any nation who could compare to him, and God loved him and made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by his foreign wives. How could you even think of committing this sinful deed and acting unfaithfully toward God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, had married a daughter of Sanballat the Hornite, another enemy. So I banished him from my presence. Remember them, O my God, for they have defiled the priesthood and the solemn vows of priests and Levites. So I purged out everything foreign and assigned tasks to the priests and Levites, making certain that each knew his work. I also made sure that the supply of wood for the altar and the first portions of the harvest were brought at the proper times. In the years Nehemiah was away, the Israelites had resumed their practice of intermarrying with pagan nations around them. This was a dramatic disobedience to God's command. Now, I know this doesn't quite translate to us today, but the warning sign does. The warning sign is misalignment, impurity. Now, we've talked about alignment before. When we get just a little misaligned, we can be way off down the road. And God, He had a good reason for this command. Throughout their history, the Israelites had fallen to pagan neighbors' belief systems over and over and over. Nehemiah even brings up Solomon as an example of what happens spiritually when he allowed himself to get misaligned from God's direction. Intermarriage caused drift as the people became misaligned with God. They followed the impure food and practices of their new spouses. They allowed idol worship to come into their lives, and they stopped giving to the temple. They allowed their temple to be desecrated and forgot all about the Sabbath. As they were deluded, they were misdirected. And we need to remember something. Judah, this tribe, was to be the family line of the Messiah, of Jesus. If this bloodline was lost, it would affect the promise God had set in place 1,000 years before. The purity of the family line was so important, and by diluting their family lines with non-Jewish people, they were losing a part of their heritage and belief system. I mean, their own children didn't even know the language of their people. Nehemiah gets pretty angry. He pulls out hair and beats them up. He knew that who and what we align with spiritually shapes future generations. I spent years in family ministry, and I saw this play out over and over. The life choices of the parent shaped the life choices of the kids in both good and not so good ways. Parents are the number one influence in their kids' lives. those kids are watching and listening and learning. So as parents, we've got to be asking, what am I teaching? For instance, I know many parents who felt like they were forced to go to church as kids. So they decided, I'm not going to force my kid to go to church. And then when their grandchildren don't even know Jesus, they wonder, what went wrong? And their heart hurts for the spiritual life of their grandchildren. Now, I realize it's a personal choice about attending church and if you make your kids go. But there are so many things that our kids don't understand enough to make good choices about. And that includes their spiritual life. So if we don't value their spiritual life, why would they? What we value and do and what we honor, that's seen by our kids and it influences their choices as they grow up. So ask yourself these questions. How do you spend your time? Where do you put your money? Who are the key relationships in your lives? These show you some of what your family actually values. For the Israelites, their marriage choice was personal. I get it. The arranged marriage was a business benefit, or I'm in love with him. And honestly, if you think about it, it was about them, but not completely. Personal compromise today can create generational consequences for tomorrow. Even though it was their personal choice, in their compromise, they were affecting their children. Now, Nehemiah, through working with the Persian government, he had to have seen how people groups were assimilated into the Persian way of life. And as he's walking with the people in Jerusalem, he sees how the effect of one generation will affect the next. Nehemiah had to purge misalignment and renew the tithe and enforce the Sabbath and discipline the unfaithful. And each time he dealt with a different element, he prayed. And that's how our chapter ends. That's how the book of Nehemiah ends, with these words. Remember this in my favor, oh my God. As the book ends, I get the impression that Nehemiah is carrying a sense of failure. He's saying, Lord, remember, I tried. He had done what he could do, and he honestly knows they'll probably do it again. They needed heart transformation, not just good intentions. And I appreciate the authenticity of this. It's real. Nehemiah isn't a story about perfect success. It's a reminder that even the best leaders, strongest reforms, and sincerest promises cannot fully change a human heart. I mean, ultimately, we don't need better discipline, and we don't just need stronger commitments. We don't just need more rules. We need a savior. Nehemiah's story leaves us looking to the one who would succeed where every human leader failed. Jesus. Jesus, well, he's a greater Nehemiah. He doesn't rebuild walls. He rebuilds hearts. And he doesn't simply call out compromise. He transforms us from within. And he doesn't just restore worship. He becomes the way back to the Father so we can worship. Dear one, spiritual strength isn't sustained by good intentions. It is formed through the daily surrender to Jesus, and through him, allowing the transformation of our hearts so that we can continue to walk with him. And I've learned that the key in what I just said is daily surrender. It's discipline, a focused choice. And as with anything worthwhile, it takes discipline over time to become a habit. And when that habit becomes something you've practiced long enough, it becomes a way of living. When I began to take Bible reading seriously, I knew it would take discipline. My desire was to live into the Word of God and to know it. So I knew I had to stick with it. And it was truly a discipline for it to become a habit, which in turn has now become a way that I live life. Now, I'm in no means perfect. I miss days and I struggle to stay engaged on other days, but where there's discipline and daily surrender, I continue. As we close this series, I just want to give you a few reminders of some of the things we've learned about our spiritual walk. You have a wall to build. Stay on your wall. Pay attention to drift. Return when you've wandered. Train daily in spiritual disciplines. And fix your eyes on Jesus. He is the perfect covenant keeper. It is only through Jesus that all this is possible. Nehemiah reminds us so much about good leadership, the power of prayer, and the need to continually pursue God. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Nehemiah. I know how valuable your time is, and I don't take it lightly that you've chosen to spend some time with me. I pray that our time together has been insightful as well as encouraging. As we move into our next series, I have some exciting new things to share with you. But for now, may you continue to seek Jesus in your everyday moments. Amen. Friend, if you know of someone that would benefit from this episode, please feel free to share it. Spiritual drift is often upon us before we ever notice it, and community and accountability through connection can help us stay on track. Thanks for joining me today.